Hello, everyone. It's Sunday. It is January something or other, I think 13th, and it's 5 p.m. and we're going to start our Syria face-to-face episode 3. So thank you for joining me. Some of you have been joining me for the last couple of weeks here. My name is Janice Kortkamp, and I'm going to be talking about Syria this evening, as usual. It's snowing out today, and it's cold. I'm warm and toasty inside, but it made me think of friends in Syria who are suffering right now because electricity and heating and cooking fuel are scarce and expensive, and it can be very cold in Syria during the winter, kind of miserable. There are a lot of places that get a lot of snow, but a lot of places are just that kind of wet, cold, chilly weather that goes through your bones, and it's hard for them to get warm. And so I'm hoping that that situation clears up soon. Just a brief introduction. Hello, everybody. I see you out there. Welcome. My name is Janice Kortkamp, and I've traveled in Syria 6 times since May of 2016. I've spent a couple of weeks there, about 3 or more weeks there each time, traveling around the country. And it's a great country. The people are amazing. I've also put in several thousand hours. I compute about over 7,000 hours over the last 6 years researching it and just completely immersing myself in studying both about the country and the conflict. And this is why I'm talking with you tonight. I've never claimed to be an expert, and I never would claim to be an expert, but I do feel I have enough knowledge and experience to have an opinion, and so that's what I'm sharing with you tonight. Most importantly, what I really care about sharing is what the Syrian people have shared with me on my travels. And so we're going to do a little bit of both tonight, where I'm talking about a couple of topics. The big one, of course, in the news is should the U.S. pull out of Syria? What about the Kurds? Those are the two questions I want to deal with in the first part, the first half hour, and then after that share some memories of my 4 days in Deir, Ezzor, and Mayadeen last October, which was really quite a life-changing experience for me in many ways. I'll never forget that time. So first, let's start with going back how I introduced the program. It is cold in Syria, and people are cold who can't buy heating oil. Electricity is scarce, and there are long lines to refill your fuel. And, you know, this is brutal to watch because these people have gone through 8 years now of war, and life is still very hard there, of course. But it's safer now, and a lot of the terrorist groups have been defeated that were making life really a living hell in Syria for so long. And now we have a different situation of more suffering with the lack of electricity and fuel, etc. One of the things that those of us can do who really care about Syria, and I'm so pleased to know so many of you out there all around the world who have really come to stand with Syria and support their cause, is to really try to put as much pressure in as many different ways as we can to our governments that have sanctions against Syria. These economic sanctions are punishing the people in Syria, and this has got to stop. So as we talk about the U.S. pulling their troops out of Syria, I'm going to be talking about the U.S. pulling out of Syria in other regards as well, and the big one is ending the sanctions against that country that has never threatened the United States, has never been a threat to the United States. And here we are punishing these people over there because they refuse to rise up against their government and force a regime change that we wanted. So end the sanctions, and people can get their lives back to normal. The rebuilding can happen a lot sooner. They can get foreign investment. They'll be able to get chemotherapy drugs that have been difficult to get. They'll be able to get prosthetic devices that have been difficult to get, specialized ones, things like drugs for when you have liver transplants and things like that, any kind of transplants. Those drugs have been very difficult. So things like that have really added to the misery and the suffering of the Syrian people. Those sanctions have got to end. Now, going back to, should the U.S. pull out of Syria, and we see a lot of this on the news of what a terrible mistake this would be and how all of the greatest military minds of our time are against this decision, and that if it should be done at all, it should be done slowly and methodically and carefully and blah, 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 blah. All that is, folks, all that is the military industrial intelligence complex doing what it does best, which is, if they're not creating wars, if they're not actively fighting wars, they want to keep wars going as long as possible. This is that self-feeding beast that I've talked about many times on Facebook, where you have, the arms makers, you have the other big corporations that are involved, like oil companies, you have bankers, you have politicians, and all of this is self-supporting. So you have think tank groups that are paid for by foreign governments and arms makers and oil companies to be the so-called experts that our politicians use to ask questions of. So the think tank people are paid to promote war. The congressmen and women are paid by lobby groups to support war. And the media, of course, has always been war sells news, so news sells war media, and it's more so now than ever. And so this is just a self-perpetuating beast that we've got to stop it in its tracks. And one of the very first steps to doing that would be for the U.S. to actually pull all of its troops out of Syria. And that includes special forces, that includes any mercenary type organizations like Blackwater kind of organizations. It includes commanders and intelligence advisors and all of this whole mechanism that is involved in these military occupations in these countries. But if we pulled out of Syria and actually kept our word and did that, we would see a possible breaking of that self-feeding cycle. And so this is really important. The other reason that there are so many reasons we should pull out. First is the Syrian people want us out of their country. They don't want the American military in there. We have no business being there. We are there actually 100% illegally, in my opinion, both by our laws and, of course, by international law. We have something called the Authorization for the Use of Military Force that is kind of an umbrella covering for all of these various and sundry conflicts that we get involved in, and all we have to do is say we're fighting terrorism or we're fighting terrorists, and that gives us a blank check, a get out of jail free card, what have you, to kind of go anywhere in the world we want to go and do whatever we want to do. But in Syria, as we did in Libya and elsewhere around the world, we're literally supporting terrorist groups there. And so obviously the AUMF cannot apply in that circumstance. A lot of Americans think that the U.S. is in Syria to fight ISIS. That's absurd. And, we have to look back. Americans typically have very short-term memory when it comes to this sort of thing. But of course, the United States supported the Taliban and the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. If you look at what we did in Iraq, if you just Google actually Camp Bucca prison system in Iraq, you will see how we literally incubated this group that is called ISIS now. And we had the commander of, the leader of ISIS in custody. We had other members of the group in custody. And then we released them. And magically they formed this group called ISIS that has formed a very convenient excuse and justification for us to go over there now and fight them. Well, there are many instances and very easily proven of us actually assisting ISIS. There was an in-depth report, a 3-year study done by a group in the UK that was tracking all of the serial numbers on all of the ISIS weaponry. And they found, as a result of that study, that much of those weapons that were in the hands of ISIS could not be accounted for simply by gathering them on the battlefield, so to speak, through victories, but instead must have been actually delivered to them. And those were United States weapons, ammunition, sent to them by, according to the study, the United States and Saudi Arabia. And this is something that has been confirmed in many reports, actually, throughout the course of the war. So we're not fighting ISIS. We're using ISIS as simply a justification for an illegal occupation that we have over almost a third of Syrian land. So this is what Americans really have to come to grips with and hold our leaders accountable for. Not only has the United States been playing this cat and mouse game with ISIS to justify our occupation there, but we have in fact been supporting Al-Qaeda in Syria and legions of other terrorist groups. So one of the primary reasons that the U.S. has to get out of Syria, and as in like yesterday, as in really 8 years ago, is because we never should have been there in the first place, and we have never done anything good in Syria for the Syrian people, ever. That just has not been a part of our plan in Syria, and the sooner that we get out, the better. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining me. So the other question that has been brought up in mainstream media about this situation is, what about the Kurds? And this is a complicated issue because we have a lot of history with the Kurds, and Syria has a lot of history with the Kurds. First and foremost, the Kurds are an ethnic group. There are many ethnic groups in Syria. I think there are over 20 individual ethnic groups that have populations in Syria, and the Kurds are just one of those groups. In many of their areas, they're not even the majority of the population. And in fact, many of the Kurds, if not most of them, are pretty recent add-ins to the Syrian population. In fact, they've come in over the last 100 years. There have been Kurds in Syria for a long time, but the majority of that population actually immigrated into Syria over the last 100 years or so. The Kurds are not united. When we say the Kurds, that's actually a misleading term, because of that ethnic group that we refer to as the Kurds, there are many different groups in that population. They have different alliances, they have different objectives, they have different things that they, some of them support the Syrian government, some of them support, the separatist movement that the United States is working with. And, it's a whole spectrum of people. Some of the Kurd militias actually are very violent. They've been engaging in ethnic and religious cleansing in the areas that they've taken over. This is not all of them, but some of them are very similar to ISIS. And so, when you talk about the Kurds, just be aware that it is a spectrum of a population. The United States has been working with what I and other people call the separatists. And so these groups have wanted to create basically a Kurdistan within Syria, particularly in that northeastern part of Syria where the U.S. is occupying now. And, this is problematic for many reasons because, as I said, not only are there many different ethnic groups that live in Syria, but there are many different ethnic groups that live in those areas that people refer to as Kurd lands. And so they can get nominalized and persecuted should there ever be something called a Kurdistan or a Kurd land in Syria. But this is something that's not acceptable to the Syrian people themselves. It's similar, I like to say, in America, should we have a Swedenistan just because there are a lot of Swedes in Minnesota, for example? Well, no, where they live in the United States of America, they're Americans. We don't have a Puerto Rico stan. We don't have, an Italian stan somewhere where there are a lot of Italians. This is something that's been promoted by the United States and Israel in particular. Those two have been whispering in the ear of these Kurd separatists and telling them, oh, we'll support you, we'll back you up, we'll protect you, and we're going to help you form this little country of your own that just so happens to exist in most of the richest oil field lands in Syria and lands for many things there. And these Kurd separatists took the bait, which is really astounding because in the 1970s and 80s, we had a similar situation in Iraq where the U.S. was promising Kurd separatist groups, claim your independence, let's create a Kurdistan, et cetera, And then a couple of times when it became politically inconvenient, we just dropped them cold and abandoned them. And in those instances, they were massacred. And one time, it was nearly 500,000 Kurdish people who died. And so, there's this history of the U.S. totally betraying the Kurds, and yet these Kurds in Syria believe the lies and the promises once again, and it just created this mess, this terrible situation. I want to tell you, though, Syria is not Iraq under Saddam Hussein. President Bashar al-Assad has a heart for the Syrian people, and that means all the Syrian people. And what makes him different is that he's not going to go massacre these Kurds, the Kurd separatists that have been working with the U.S. All that has happened is he wants to enter into negotiations with them. And this is what is going on right now. There's no final decision yet, but one will come, and the Kurd groups will have to reassimilate into Syrian society and decide to become Syrians. Kurds who live in Syria, Syrian Kurds. And this is what has to happen. And so, we'll see that unfold, but they will not, if it is in any way, shape, or form in the power of the Syrian Arab Army, the Syrian government, and its allies, they will not allow those Kurds to be massacred. There are a lot of other complications in there, like Turkey. He wants to attack some of the Kurd groups that he considers terrorists, and he uses that as a justification for wanting to do another illegal invasion in Syria. He's already in Syria illegally. So it is a mess, and nothing is guaranteed. But I am absolutely convinced that the best course for the Kurds is to negotiate with Damascus, work with the Syrian Arab Army, and those are the people that are going to care about them for the long term. So I hope that makes sense. One of the things that I wanted to talk about was statement that Secretary of State Pompeo made recently. And actually, going back, Joe Eldred is online, and he made an excellent comment. He said, Congress has to declare war, and they have not, so it is illegal. Nor should we be declaring war on Syria, because, again, Syria has never threatened the United States, has never been a threat to the United States, and in fact had wanted good relations with the United States and Europe. And President Bashar al-Assad had traveled to Europe. He lived in England for a number of years. He was an ophthalmologist there, an eye surgeon. And it was definitely and obviously his desire to have good relations with the West. But the requirement was that those be mutually respectful and mutually beneficial relations, and not a master-slave or master-puppet kind of relationship. That is something that Syria will never accept. They are a strong, deeply rooted civilization. They've been a geopolitical entity since there were such things. Damascus and Aleppo are the oldest continuously populated cities in the world. Their roots go literally back to the dawn of civilization itself. And so you have this very deep-rooted culture, this civilization, that really is not interested in these young upstarts of the West, particularly America, telling them what they can and cannot do. They don't see that as our role or right or any of our business, and they are 100% correct about that. So going back to Secretary of State Pompeo's statement, where he said, the U.S. has always been, I can't even say it without laughing, the U.S. has always been a force for good in the Middle East. And this is so troubling, because either the man is completely and utterly delusional, or he is a total, absolute liar. He cannot be anything other than those two, because even a school child should understand, particularly after the devastation that we've left behind in Iraq and Libya, what has happened in Syria, the history of our manipulations. For example, going back to 1949, when the CIA attempted its first coup to overthrow a Syrian government. 1949 is when we tried the coup against Syria. In 1953, we did a coup in Iran and actually overthrew the secular, democratically elected leader in Iran in 1953, and we imposed and installed our little puppet Shah. And so, since the beginning, and I've been learning that, it goes much farther back than that, but we have done nothing in the Middle East that is not selfish-driven, is not greed-driven, is not lie-driven. And for Pompeo to make that statement, to me, what was most troubling about it is that they just feel like they'll never be held accountable for any of these statements and actions. Right now, we have Secretary of State Pompeo and the National Security Advisor, John Bolton, literally doing everything they can to get us to go to war against Iran. And a war in Iran, folks, would be, well, it would make Vietnam, for all its devastation, death and destruction, failure, human catastrophe, it would make Vietnam look like child's play. I mean, the people of Iran would never, ever stop. The terrain there is incredibly difficult. We know virtually nothing about that country and society, and we would be attempting again to destroy another country again that is not an aggressor nation. Iran has not invaded another country in something like over 200 years. Literally every justification that you're hearing to support a possible action against Iran, again, are lies. If you take those lies and turn them 180 degrees and put them back onto the US and Israel and Saudi Arabia, then you'll be close to the truth of what's really going on there. The aggressors are the United States, Israel, Saudi Arabia, trying to take full control of the Middle East and all of its natural resources. And Iran is merely, it's the strong player that's in the way. So please make the effort to learn the reality of what's going on here. It's very difficult for Americans sometimes to accept these realities. We have this rah, support our troops, go Team USA attitude. And I'm telling you, folks, it's all lies. The United States of America, our government, does not support our troops. I don't think anyone is lied to more than our servicemen and women. And there are many veterans, both officers and, just normal soldier people, who are talking openly about this. They're being used and abused. And, so if you really do have a feeling to support our troops, stop supporting these wars based on lies that are not only killing our troops and sending them home injured, permanently injured, emotionally scarred with PTSD and drug addiction problems. Many veterans are turning to crime. None of this is good. So what Secretary of State Pompeo said is opposite of reality. It's like a Star Trek episode, when they'd have an alternate universe. That is alternate universe talk. It is absolutely, unequivocally, very easy to prove untrue. We have not been about doing good in the Middle East. But it would be nice for us to start. I remember, when Donald Trump was running for president, and of course he was saying, "Make America great again." And my call was, let's make America good for a change. Let's actually operate with integrity and rational thought and with a vision for the future, as opposed to, as General Wesley Clark said, we look at every problem. All we have is a hammer, which is our military, and so we look at every problem as a nail. We've absolutely given up completely on any idea of diplomacy. We go around bullying and sanctioning other countries. We call them illegitimate. We start supporting rebel groups in several countries around the world to try to overthrow them. I mean, this is just a nasty way of doing business, and it's not serving us either. We've talked about before how the Pentagon, there's never been a successful audit of the Pentagon. They tried recently and they just gave up. It's impossible. They said the books are cooked. So our Department of Defense literally has been lying in their accounting. They've lost track of trillions of dollars. These wars have already cost us something like $5.6 trillion just since 9/11. They have been total, absolute failures and utter disasters. So why is any rational American still supporting these reckless and malignant policies? It's time for us all to rise up and shout out about it and really put pressure on our politicians and our media to tell the truth and to hold the leaders responsible for who are making these decisions. I see that I have my break time is here. Sid, do you have something for me? We did coffee last week, and this week I just wanted to do something simple because it is cold and snowy outside. And so Sid made me a cup of hot tea like they do in Syria. And I wanted to tell you about this because wherever you go in Syria, you'll either get a cup of coffee or a cup of tea. And so if you sit down, and everybody will either get a little tiny cup of coffee or a little cup of tea. This is way too big. I didn't have the right glass, but in a little thin glass cup that has no handle on it. And so you get a nice hot steaming cup of tea in a thin glass with no handle. And it reminds me of, thank you, honey.
It's hot.
It's hot. It reminds me of those little lizards in the desert when their feet get too hot. You know, they pull up their feet like that off the sand. And that's what you have to do is you hold that cup of tea while it cools down so that you can drink it. And one thing that they do that's really odd, and I haven't figured out why yet, but everybody will have their own little cup of tea, but there'll be actually one glass of water on the table as well. And you know, I'm a water drinker, and so I always snag it and start drinking the water. But I always wonder what the real protocol is for sharing one glass of water around the whole group. Thank you, Sid. I asked Sid to, can they see you? Come on in. To be my man on the street tonight, and I'm going to ask him, man on the street, should the U.S. pull out of Syria? What do you think?
You're asking me that question?
Yes.
Well, if I were going to answer that question, I guess I would have to answer it and say it all depends on who you are. Should the U.S. pull out of Syria? Are you the military-industrial complex? Have you based your retirement plan on your Raytheon stock? Are you a globalist that believe that world domination is more important than being a human being? If you're a normal American that listens to network news and believe that we have to save the Syrian people from this brutal dictator that barrel bombs and chemical weapons children, right as he's beautifully won a battle, then he always comes in and makes sure he drops some poison gas on his kids.
He's being facetious there, by the way.
Excuse me, but no, if you do believe network news, then there's no reason to pull out of Syria.
But if you're a human being that has a brain and not afraid to use it, what would you say?
Well, our learning curve is thanks to Jan and vetting people on the internet and listening and asking questions. If you're a human being, if you believe in borders, if you believe in sanity, if you believe that sanctioning people is choking them to death. Our military has no business in Syria. It is for oil. It is to control the flow and everything over in that area. And as our president said, troops out of Syria. We've heard that before. His heart would love to do it, but he is surrounded by people that believe otherwise and will hold him in prayer. We're trying.
I hope his heart wants to do it. Thank you, honey. I'm looking for questions here. Thank you, everybody, for joining in. I think we've covered just about everything on those questions. I wanted to spend some time doing the fun part, which is actually it's kind of serious this time, and that's describing adventures and travels in Deir, Ezzor last October of 2017, I should say. had the opportunity, thanks to a friend of mine who's an independent journalist in Syria, to go with some other activists and independent journalists to Deir Ezzor. And Deir Ezzor at that time, now Deir Ezzor is the big province there in the northeast part of Syria, and this is where ISIS had control for years, and part of that area is where the U.S. is now. It is that northeastern quadrant of Syria is kind of cut in half by the Euphrates River. The United States is on the far side, and the Syrian forces control the western side. And so you have this situation of, these two forces claiming to be fighting ISIS. Well, one actually is. That's the Syrian Arab Army with their allies of Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah. The city of Deir Ezzor had been under siege by ISIS for almost 3 years, and most of the city had fallen under control of ISIS. It's a large city there. It was very beautiful before the war from the pictures that I've seen and the stories I've been told. So ISIS had the city under siege. They took control of most of it, and there was a pocket, though, that remained in the hands of the Syrian army and the Syrian government. And those people held out under ISIS siege. I think it was about 2 years, or a little over 2 years. Finally, in September of 2017, a group of soldiers, a large force of Syrian army soldiers and Russians and everyone actually broke that siege, and they met up with the fellows of the Syrian army that had been holding that area secure for years. That was a huge, huge moment in the history of this war. 6 weeks after that happened, when most of Deir Ezzor city was under full control of the Syrian army, there were sleeper cells of ISIS still reported to be in the city. There was one street, we were out walking one day, and they said, you have to stop here because in the next streets over are snipers, for example. It was pretty crazy. But we got the opportunity to go, and it was kind of odd because all of us, there was me and 3 others. One of them was Dr. Tim Anderson, who wrote the book, The Dirty War on Syria, which is a must-read. Dr. Anderson is an amazing man of integrity and compassion and knowledge. It was just a privilege to spend time with him. We all piled in a little van, left Damascus, went to Homs, drove through Palmyra, and when we got to Palmyra, which of course had been taken over by ISIS and then recaptured by the Syrians and then captured again by ISIS and then finally recaptured by the Syrian Arab Army and its allies, we went through Palmyra, and it's a very sobering moment because there's that checkpoint outside of the town, and we met up with a Hezbollah soldier there, and he told one of the guys in our group, only God can protect you from here forward to Deir Ezzor, because you've got this long stretch of road in the desert, not very much traffic. There were still ISIS attacks happening on that road from time to time. And, when a Hezbollah soldier says something like that, or any Syrian army soldier, anyone says that, it really makes you pay attention. And for the entirety of that ride, I have to say I was praying that the van not break down on that road. I want to say something quickly about the Hezbollah guys, because they have been a remarkable force for good during this war in Syria. Incredibly professional. Many of them have sacrificed their lives to save people in Syria. They are well respected by virtually everyone I've met there. And they're not a terrorist organization like has been said about them here in the U.S. They are an armed political party in Lebanon with an army, and thanks to that army, a lot of Syrian people, including many Christian villages and areas, were saved from Al-Qaeda and ISIS and other terrorist groups. So they have my respect, like the Syrian army soldiers and the Russians that are there. Those guys have fought very, very hard battles. Going to Deir, Ezzor, the dog is scratching. Going to Deir, Ezzor, we passed through that long road, and we got to the checkpoint at Deir, Ezzor outside the city. And we were pretty excited to have made it, that far on the road. We were happy to be safe. And we got some terribly sad news when we hit the checkpoint. It was the day that General Issam Zaharaddin died by a landmine in Deir Ezzor. This man, who was really like a Hercules kind of figure, just an extraordinary soldier to watch, what he'd been doing, the victories, how his absolute, almost epic endurance that he had. His son fought beside him all those years in Deir Ezzor against ISIS. And, he had become a real hero of mine and all of us that were in the group. And to hear that news, it was just staggering, really. He had survived all that time, and to die that day, we were actually scheduled to meet him the next day, and it was something that had been a dream of mine for a long time. And that was really hard to hear that news. And in fact, the whole city was kind of in mourning all the while that we were there. So we got to the city. We went to the governor's offices, the governor's building, and were very well received. We were basically the first delegation of Westerners to go to Deir Ezzor since the city had been liberated from ISIS. So that was really astounding. And the governor's wife made a beautiful meal for us to welcome us. We didn't know going there whether or not we would be out in tents or sleeping on the ground. Literally, we had no idea. And they had put us up in a private home that had survived through the war. Very, very nice place, owned by a doctor. And, there's no electricity there or running water, but it was very comfortable. And the owner would put the generator on for us at night so we could recharge our phones and stuff. We had no connectivity, but we were using our phones and cameras and stuff to take pictures. Anyway, Deir Ezzor is, again, it was a beautiful city before the war. It had gotten down, I think it was something, it was over 200,000 people or more before the war. And when we saw it was 50 or 60,000 people remained. There was a lot of damage in the city. It had a very frontier, really post-apocalyptic look and feel to it. The people, of course, this had just been 6 weeks since they had been freed from ISIS. And, so there was kind of a walking ghost look in their eye, like I had seen in Aleppo, really, 4 months after its liberation. These people all have been through trauma that we just cannot begin to understand. There were years of where they were very hungry because of the ISIS siege. They had very little food. Most of the doctors left. Almost all of the doctors had left. There were a few who remained. Life was just brutal, and ISIS is brutal. Of course, there are a lot of military in the town at that time, and still is. They're still fighting ISIS in those areas. Some of the remaining fighting groups that are around. And, it was kind of hard to, how do you interact with these people that have lived through years of being surrounded by ISIS and being affected by ISIS. One of the things that I noticed as we talked to people, we walked around the city, and basically the underlining mentality was they had been dead for 3 years, and they were just walking dead for 3 years, and they felt that they were alive again. And that, my friends, is thanks again to the Syrian Arab Army, the Russians, the Iranians, and the Hezbollah fighters that were battling ISIS, truly battling ISIS. It's hard for me as an American to talk about how the U.S. has supported ISIS through the war. Like I said, we incubated ISIS in our Camp Bucca prison system in Iraq. ISIS came over. The U.S. was already in Syria to some extent, did nothing to stop the takeover of Raqqa from ISIS and the takeover of most of that area there. In fact, ISIS was able to operate very freely, and they had thousands and thousands of trucks filled with oil that they had stolen from Syrian ground, and that oil went in these massive truck convoys up to Turkey and ended up being distributed in Europe and elsewhere. Very cheap oil. And Europe was buying it. And ISIS had an income stream of $1 million to $3 million a day sometimes. And that's what allowed them to become, one of the things that allowed them to become so powerful. Again, the U.S. was not doing anything. In fact, John Kerry said that the U.S. was watching ISIS grow. It was a private conversation that ended up getting recorded and released. And he said very bluntly that we were watching ISIS grow in order to try to put pressure on the popular and legitimate president of Syria to negotiate with us, basically to step down. That's when Syria called in Russia, and Russia answered. And Russia came in and started helping to fight ISIS. That was in 2015. And the rest is history, as they say. Battle by battle, place by place, Syria has been liberated not just from ISIS, but from Al-Qaeda and from dozens and dozens of other groups that all share the same basic ideology. And so now most of Syria is safe. It's stable. And the people are trying to put their lives back together, like they were doing in Deir Ezzor when I was there. All of a sudden, as soon as the siege was broken, as soon as the Syrians and their allies had taken control of the city and had secured the road for the most part, fruits and vegetables and all kinds of foods came in. People were reopening their businesses or opening new businesses. It still was a very hard life. It still is. But it's better than it was by an immeasurable amount. We got to go to a refugee center in Deir Ezzor, and these were people from the town called Mayadeen, which just 2 weeks before had been liberated from ISIS by the Syrian army and its allies. And these people had fled as the fighting was going on, and they were protected by the Syrian army and put in this refugee center. And they said the same thing, that they were dead for years under ISIS. But one of the things that was very hard during that visit was there was a man who he and his family lived in Mayadeen. He had 3 children. They were starving, and he was trying to steal some flour at one point to make bread for his family, for his kids. And he was caught, and he was tried in the Sharia court that the ISIS fighters had set up. And it was judged by a Saudi Arabian. And many of the ISIS fighters were Saudi, many of the ISIS commanders were Saudi. And the Sharia court judges were often Saudis as well. And the judge sentenced him to get his one hand and one foot cut off. And that's what they did. And at some point, I think it was after that, his 7-year-old son was run over by some ISIS fighters in a vehicle. I don't know if that was, supposed accidental death or murder, but he felt it was murder. And so we met this man who had been through this experience, and he was a broken man. Still had dignity to him, and he really touched our hearts. But it's just so painful to see, how evil it was there. Many of the people from Mayadeen supported ISIS in the town. They actually supported ISIS. They were religious fundamentalists, and they supported the terrorist ideology. And actually, one of them was in that refugee center, and I knew she was. I was talking to this woman, and she, of course, was in full burqa and black head to foot, and she was holding a girl. I'm assuming it was her daughter. And I was just in my usual t-shirt and blue jeans. And she was looking at me, and through hand gestures, and somebody else there kind of spoke a little bit of English. And she was saying, basically that I was naked because I was in a t-shirt and blue jeans, and didn't I want to put on a burqa and be, a modest, good, righteous woman. So, you have that dynamic there as well. This is a situation like we've had throughout much of Syria, like is in Idlib right now, and some of these ISIS villages and areas right now is, yes, there are civilians there. Yes, there are good civilians, normal people just trying to survive hell and brutal life, just trying to hold on to their homes, and they're keeping their families safe as much as they can. And then there are other civilians that actually do support terrorists like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and colluded with them. And, this actually creates a difficult situation, and one that Syria is going to have to deal with for generations to come. Later on in the trip, we got the opportunity to actually go to Al-Mayadeen, and it was about 45 minutes south along the Euphrates River to the town of Al-Mayadeen. And this was another extraordinary experience because it had, as I said, just been liberated from ISIS 2 weeks before. At one point, we were walking around, and the soldiers that were escorting us said, "Do you want to see some dead ISIS fighters?" And, I was kind of like, well, yeah, sure, I guess. And so we went over to this one side street, and there were these 2 corpses there. That picture is actually in the video I shared this morning. And they were, their documents said that they were from Saudi Arabia as well. And, it didn't bother me seeing those really, by that point, pretty rotten, stinky corpses. But I was just glad they were dead because, a lot of those guys, if they're allowed to live, if they live and they go somewhere else, they're going to do the same things. And nobody wants that to happen. So, unfortunately, this is one of the costs of the way that the United States has been doing these wars, by supporting groups and aiding and abetting them either directly or indirectly we've created these problems that have repercussions for generations to come, like how we're fighting the Taliban now in Afghanistan. Well, we promoted and supported them in the 1980s. And this is the same reckless kind of plan that we did in Libya, and we did a lot in Iraq, and we did in Syria. In Mayadeen, which was one of the weapons and economic capitals of ISIS, they were very powerful there. It was a very tough battle. Some of those battles that the Syrian army fought and their allies against ISIS, they had, 70% casualty rates and higher. It was just a killing floor in many of those battles. And I've heard that, some people say, oh, there is no Syrian army, they're all foreigners. That is a bunch of bull crap. Excuse my language. It's absolute nonsense. The sons and even the daughters of Syria have been putting up this fight, have been defending their homeland. And anytime somebody says something like that, I just want to, the steam starts coming out my ears, because they have no idea of the tremendous fight and sacrifices that the Syrian army has made for to protect their families and to save their homeland. So Al Mayadeen, we toured factories that were making mortars and other weapons. We saw how ISIS had actually coined money, so they would force the Syrian people, the civilians, to turn in their Syrian money to use these, stupid ISIS coins. I mean, they were very organized, and this was one of their great strengths. That organization has been broken. And when people say ISIS is defeated in Syria, gosh, we're almost out of time. I've just been rambling on here. When people say that ISIS is defeated, what really has happened is the organization, the command structure, the centers of strength have indeed been totally broken. But you have cells that are still there that can cause tremendous amount of trouble. Not surprisingly, they're strongest near where the United States occupying forces are. Again, they're playing this cat and mouse game. I'm going to have to end it here. I hope this was helpful to people, but I have a kind of a fun story to tell from Deir, Ezzor, and I love this story. I was there, like I said, with several people. We were in the house. One of my dearest friends in Syria was with us, a lady, and she was doing a lot of the cooking with us. I mean, she's a brilliant lady, and she was helping us with all of our research and stuff as well. But she was doing all the cooking for us, and she made one night a very special meal, and she was excited about it. I saw that a lot of the Syrians that were looking on it were excited about it. She's an excellent cook, so she presented it. She put it on the table before us. And of course, I dug in because I love Syrian food, and it was a little texture was difficult for me, a little bit chewy like a calamari, and it was filled with kind of yummy stuff, rice and seasonings and things. And I noticed at that time that all the Syrians were looking at me and kind of, laughing and asking if they could take my picture. And then I knew that I was in big trouble, because I was probably eating something pretty weird. And it tasted wasn't really my thing. And it turned out it was sheep's testicles and sheep intestines. And as soon as I heard what it was, of course, everybody busted out laughing. I couldn't eat it anymore. And I felt kind of guilty about that, like a real wussy American. But, I just couldn't do it. So that's one of the reasons I just had tea tonight, was I could have really freaked everybody out and tried to prepare sheep's testicles, but I thought I'd spare you on that one. Thanks again, everyone, for joining me. what I'll do is I'll look at all of the questions and comments and answer them all as I can tomorrow. And I really appreciate you sitting in and letting me just kind of share with you some of these things and the memories and the opinions. And as always, I appreciate the support, and I hope that you all have a very good evening. Thank you. Good night. If it'll let me in the video. There we go.